Thank you all for coming to this IISS event on scanning the horizon for 2018, what's next in cyber and space. Although the title is forward-looking, we're actually going to do two things. We're going to look back, have a retrospective of the most salient events in the cyber and space realm in 2017, and then look ahead for an analytical forecasts for 2018 and beyond. Essential theme of this event is that military and commercial developments in both cyberspace and outer space are posing new foreign policy challenges. Our two presenters will highlight potentially destabilizing trends and assess their likely impact on the future of international peace and security. My name is Mark Fitzpatrick. I am the Executive Director of the Washington-based office of IISS Americas. And I'm fortunate to have two real experts in cyber and space leading this discussion today. The first is my colleague, Sean Canuck, who came to IISS last summer to be the director of what is now the Cyber, Space, and Future Conflict Program. In a way, our event today, which was postponed from the end of last year, is kind of a coming out event for Sean, the think tank equivalent of a debutante ball, as it were. I think even one of my colleagues mischievously put in the office calendar that this was Sean's debutante event. So Sean works out of our Washington office for, of course, IISS as a whole. He leads the program that assesses advanced technologies and forecasts the evolution of strategic risk. Complementing his IISS role, Sean serves as the chair of the Research Advisory Group for the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. He's also a co-organizer of the Roundtable on Military Cyber Stability between China, Russia, and the United States. From 2011 to 2016, he served as the first U.S. National Intelligence Officer for cyber issues after a decade in the Central Intelligence Agency's Information Operations Center. Joining him on the panel is Todd Harrison, the director of the Aerospace Security Project and director of the Defense Budget Analysis at CSIS. As a senior fellow in the International Security Program there, he heads the center's efforts to provide in-depth research and analysis of space security, air power, and defense funding issues. Todd previously worked at Booz Allen Hamilton, where he consulted for the Air Force on satellite communications systems and supported a variety of other clients evaluating the performance of acquisition programs. So we're going to run until 3 o'clock today. I'll ask each of the experts to give a presentation that won't last more than 15 minutes, and then we'll have the usual discussion. This event is on the record, and it's being taped. It's not being live broadcast, but the tape will be on the website afterwards. So, Sean, this is your coming out event. Tell us what you think of things and what you're going to be doing in your program for the next period of time.
All right, well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. The debutante moniker is amusing to me, but I would like to take this opportunity to take a little bit of a retrospective on what we've been seeing happening in cyberspace, and then forecast how some of those strategic trends are likely to carry forward. And of course, the areas that I'm going to be discussing here today are going to be some of the focal points of IISS's research agenda moving forward in this space. There's a lot of institutions and organizations studying cyber issues today, and here at IISS, we want to bring our long experience in systemic analysis and strategic issues to play to look at how some of these capabilities and doctrines are going to be interfacing in the future in a very rigorous analytic way. So on each of your chairs, you should have a couple handouts that you can take with you today. The set of colored slides that I provided, I'm not going to go through everything on those slides in detail, but I want to offer them as a framework for how to think about what you've been seeing happening and reading about in the press in the last year or so, and then extrapolate some of those trends into the future. So there's a slide on the front that has strategic trends in a left-hand column and salient milestones in a right-hand column. So let me start there. Some of the core strategic trends that we've been identifying, the words in red on the left, intervention. A lot of people talked about cyber Pearl Harbors and cyber Armageddons, when in fact what we've been seeing is intervention at the interstate level below the threshold for armed conflict that would allow you to act under Article 51 of the UN Charter or would trigger Articles 4 and 5 of the Washington Treaty for NATO. Second issue would be industry. We increasingly see private sector entities that operate critical infrastructures being the technological enablers or the targets or the unintended victims of cyber activities. And if you'll note on that slide, I have some dotted lines linking these various strategic trends to examples of how we've seen them play out. So for example, interventions below armed conflict level certainly influence efforts in foreign elections would qualify there. And then looking at industry as a focal point, when we see the impact that the malware WannaCry or NotPetya had on entities like Maersk Shipping Company or Federal Express or the British National Health Service. That's not purely a private company, but it was certainly most likely an unintended target. You can see the relationship of how some of these trends have played out in what have been the leading news stories of the last year, year and a half. The next strategic trend from the left column, infrastructures. As we move to just-in-time economies that are incredibly streamlined without costly redundancies, what we're actually also creating are strategic single points of failure. And whether we're dependent on a single, microchip producer or a couple of them, as we saw with the recent meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities that were identified in Intel and AMD chips, that the vast majority of the ecosystem is actually dependent on entities that face those vulnerabilities. Or when you look at various malware that's affected Microsoft code or others that's used ubiquitously around the planet, we see the impact that these streamlined economies create from a strategic resiliency viewpoint. I'll also note that when systems of that nature or in the Internet of Things become increasingly automated, the potentialities for disrupting those systems again become magnified with unforeseen cascading effects possible through horizontal and vertical integration in economies. We've seen those interconnected nature of the economy also targeted indirectly as a means to getting desired effects when the desired target itself was not directly accessible. A clear example of that would be using a heating and cooling company's computer systems, which were not well protected, as an entree point into the target retailer company a few years back. So it was an indirect attack taken to get to an endpoint where then further criminal activity was created. And here I'm just giving a couple simple examples, but for each of these strategic trends, we can find many examples of how they're playing out. The last trend I really want to focus on is the integrity of the information itself. Most of what we've seen in past years has been discussion of breaches of confidentiality, espionage, stealing information that was meant to be secretive, or obstructing the availability of data. This is where we have ransomware or denial of service attacks that impair one's ability to access one's own information. Well, I think increasingly you're going to see assaults on the information itself, not removing access to it, but making it uncertain or its value uncertain to its authorized user. And if you think about this in the context of executive decision making, whether you're a political leader, a combatant commander, an executive officer at a company, or even an investor, you regularly rely on the information you're receiving to make decisions. Now, what happens if the information you're receiving from your data streams or from your own databases in your company is uncertain? Clearly significant concerns, and if others are able to exploit the value of that information before you yourself can. So one news story from last year that received much less attention than I think it should have was the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission acknowledging that its online filing system for proprietary information, the Edgar filing system, was most likely compromised through a cyber penetration, and that information may have been used for insider trading. Here again, cyber exploitation is being used for other means, but that go directly to the utility and the value of the information at hand. Similarly, when we talk about influencing domestic politics in another country through international interventions, the use of social media to affect an electorate's preferences or to raise doubts about the veracity of news stories. This is all going after the utility of the information itself. And that's one thing you'll hear me discuss a lot in my strategic work is cyber is a little bit of a misnomer. A fixation on critical infrastructure protection it's relevant, it's important from a societal public safety view, but it's not getting to the real core strategic issue, which is the value of the information itself that we use these ICT systems to communicate and propagate. So with that little bit of an overview of a framework, let me invite you to turn to the back side of that paper where I have listed what I call the core themes for cybersecurity. And I've given presentations on these topics in a couple different locales, and quite frankly, what you have on the left-hand side is a bit of the framework and structure I gave at the European Cybersecurity Forum last fall. And on the right-hand side is something I was asked to do for keynoting a conference in Tokyo, where they'll be hosting the Olympics in 2020 and have a lot of information security focus leading up to that. But this conference was looking out beyond that as well, asking what comes next? And that's where I think, I'd like to focus our discussion here today. So in the left-hand column, you have a lot of technical hardware and software that's created for its functional application with security only as an afterthought. We're in an environment where offenders have a distinct advantage over defense. It is much more difficult and time-consuming to reverse engineer a software or hardware device, to test it in every way possible. That takes much more of the same quality of skilled resources than it would to actually create an exploit or a vulnerability. And when we think about cybersecurity, it's not just about the technology itself, it's about the people and the processes that are involved with it. It's a holistic ecosystem because, again, the technology itself is just an end to other means. You may be a government trying to provide public services to your citizenry. You may be a company trying to manufacture something and generate profits. So you have an ultimate objective more than just cybersecurity of your IT network. And that's really critical when you think about exploitation of those systems. And also when you think about how to induce or deter actions by different individuals. When we're thinking about regulatory or legislative solutions to help resolve some of these concerns, you can create incentives, but they have to be based on the interests and the limitations of the entities themselves. So criminal cyber threat actors often have a very different modus operandi and different objectives than state actors. Criminals are interested in making profits. Criminals, their activities will likely be detected, but they will hope to avoid prosecution. If you think about intelligence agencies, for example, they're probably not out for profit motivations in most cases, and they're seeking to have their activities remain secretive and undetected for a lengthy period of time, preferably forever, but we increasingly see that that's probably not possible. So when I was asked to look out even beyond those current core themes, I asked, what would it be like if I was giving this Scanning the Horizon talk 2 years from now instead of today? And I think the first thing I've already touched on is it's not going to be about data and data sets in your systems. It's going to be about the informational value. And in fact, I can envision a future where excessive data is actually an obstacle to capitalizing on the value of information, especially when increasing amounts of that data is intentionally created and disseminated to mislead. I see a future where the human-machine interface continues to develop, and I see that our increasing capabilities to program, and by that I mean encode and decode DNA itself, allows us to go directly to the source. What do I mean by that? working on threats or solutions to human problems based in the language that our own bodies speak of DNA, rather than in the machine medium of silica-based chips. And that's a little bit futuristic, but we're already starting to see it. And the bottom of that column, I have bio, info, and nano interconnected. And if you're seeing the research that's happening in these different fields, we are very quickly going to be in a world where we're going to be able to be adapting our bodies and the biological environment around us in ways that have been unforeseen, and that will have both security concerns and security benefits that I think we're going to start seeing in the coming years. Finally, that environmental discussion quickly leads into the health and energy consortium. Those three trends, I think we're going to be really seeing cyber as a means to an end rather than as a focus area in its own right. When I was in government, I, on multiple occasions, said, I hope that I would only have one successor with the title I had, and that title was National Intelligence Officer for Cyber Issues. I personally feel that if 4 and 5 years from now we're still thinking about cyber as a unique discipline, we will have actually missed the importance of it as a field. It is a part of everything we're doing. It is improving the scale, the speed, the availability of everything we're doing. But at the end of the day, it is not the end in itself. And if you look at those real-world news stories from the other side of the page, none of those were just about the machines themselves. They were about how they affect our actual lives or our actual enterprises. And that's what's really critical looking forward. So I'm going to leave you, and we'll have a chance to pick up any of these themes in the Q&A. So this is just a brief overview, and then Todd Harrison will do the overview of space. But when I look out of what I'm watching for, one of these other shoes going to drop, things that we've been thinking would happen at some point and are probably, in most cases, unfortunately, coming pretty soon. I think in the European context, with the General Data Protection Regulation that's taking effect in May, and what seems like a activist interest in Europe of applying it, and it has some pretty serious punitive measures for those who violate it. I can imagine that certain companies that do a lot of large-scale operations involving personal data, that there may be some limitations on which services they will initially provide. Maybe Europe won't be the marketplace where certain features are rolled out until they can actually be done in a way that will be certain to comply with those data privacy requirements. Secondly, and I don't wish this at all, but when I see what happened at the National Health Service computers in Britain, when I see some of the logistics impairments or public utility impairments that have happened in countries like Ukraine and elsewhere, I'm concerned that in the next year or two we may actually start to see deaths that are directly attributable to malicious cyber activity. And then on the election front, certainly we have our congressional midterm elections coming up later this year in the United States. I don't think the efforts to influence elections is going to go away. I think social media is still going to be a very effective platform for pursuing that. But I actually think we're going to see companies, whether it's Facebook or others, taking active measures to limit or at a minimum publicize the origins and the provenance of certain memes or advertisements that are occurring on their website. So a more activist private sector, which of course raises the question of what kind of oversight and who should be conducting oversight of the political discourse in a country, whether it's the United States, the United Kingdom, or any other. And then, lastly but not least, looking out beyond 2020 for what to watch for, I do believe there will be future liability rules imposed on certain IT products. Those conversations are already underway. I firmly believe that we will see nation states take overt cyber measures in the future where they feel they would have the legal right to take military measures. So I can imagine a world where instead of taking a military countermeasure, something was done with cyber, but with packets that were attributable to a specific country and where the country specifically acknowledged they took that action. Heretofore, the countries that have taken actions have all done it in a plausibly deniable or way or denounced that they themselves had done it. And then finally, I can imagine with the ubiquity and the value of cyber connectivity being so important to so many entities and countries around the planet, just the way currencies and finances. I can imagine foreign affairs in the future making an effort to use what would be the equivalent, a cyber sanction of holding that leverage over actors whose behavior is not approved, the same way that financial transactions and financial markets have been used to exclude certain entities in the past through financial sanctions. So that's a little bit of forecasting and a strategic framework through which I'm viewing these issues. And I think I'll stop there and turn the floor over to Todd, and then we can all revisit whichever of these interest you in the Q&A.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, and it's great to hear that this is your coming out event. I don't know if there's such a thing as think tank hazing, but maybe we could invent it. I dare to wonder what that would even look like. So I wanted to talk today a little bit. I have this handout for you, the one that's in black and white. It's an excerpt from a report that we published back in October. And we've been looking at this issue of what's going on in the space domain and how does it affect the balance of power, and particularly the potential for conflict in space, and what are the dynamics around escalation and deterrence when it comes to space systems. In our research, what we realized is there are really two eras to look at. And unfortunately, a lot of our thinking today and a lot of our space systems that we've designed and policies that we have in place throughout government were really designed for the first era. And the first era was basically during the Cold War, from the first launch of Sputnik in '57 all the way through the end of the Soviet Union around 1990. That was really the first space age. And that period of time, space was largely dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. The two countries were responsible for more than 90% of all the launches at that time. And if you look at what the US and Soviets were doing in space, it was predominantly national security missions, military. And so that's what dominated space. Now, there were counter space weapons almost from the very beginning. I think the first ASAT test was back in 1959. So no sooner did we have the ability to put something in space, we all started working on the ability to shoot it down. So we've had a variety of anti-satellite type weapons, counter space weapons that existed throughout the first space age. And it was a concern, but we had a stable deterrence posture in space because we were using our military space systems primarily to support nuclear deterrence. And nuclear deterrence held on Earth, and so deterrence held in space, and it worked just fine. But then you fast forward to the modern era, what we call the second space age, things have changed. So if you turn on the second page here, I like to think of it as the 4 Ds. Space has gotten more diverse, disruptive, disordered, and dangerous. So more diverse. Well, what's happened, as you can see on the graph on the first page, the number of countries using space, being able to access space, is growing. And today, the majority of launches are not from the United States and Russia. It's from other countries, China, Europeans, Japan, India. They all have significant space programs now and are launching a lot of satellites. If you look at the uses of space, what satellites are used for, it's predominantly commercial now. And so there are all sorts of new commercial satellites going up every day, and there are many more planned on the horizon. If you look at the forecast, we're looking at what could be exponential growth in the space launch market. Now, those of us who've been around in this business long enough, we've seen this before, right? In the late 1990s, we saw similar kind of projections, huge growth in commercial space. It didn't happen that time. Many of these constellations were canceled. Some of them that did launch failed, went into bankruptcy. Things could be different this time. We'll have to wait and see. And so what is going on, though, in the commercial space is very disruptive. And I mean disruptive in a good way. It's disrupting markets. It's disrupting a lot of the incumbents in the space business. We see all of these new companies coming in, especially in space launch. It's kind of amazing what's going on in the space launch industry. You've got these 4 companies backed by billionaires that are coming in and just rewriting the rules. We're all familiar with Spacex, founded by Elon Musk. You got Blue Origin, is Jeff Bezos' company, and They've been relatively quiet, but Blue Origin, they are investing about $1 billion a year of Jeff Bezos' own money into that company. They're going to be doing big things. He wouldn't be spending $1 billion a year of his own money if he didn't have big plans. You look at Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic and Virgin Orbit. They've now split up those two companies. Virgin Orbit is mainly focused on the small end of the launch market. Virgin Galactic is focused on space tourism. And then, of course, Paul Allen has got Stratolaunch. He built the largest airplane in history, and they're going to air launch rockets to send payloads into space. So there's a lot of dynamic stuff going on. And what's interesting is a lot of this is happening independent of the government. Now, yes, SpaceX has gotten NASA contracts. They've more recently gotten national security launch contracts, but they're doing it in a different way. And it's not DoD or NASA that's writing the requirements for their systems and what they're building. Right now, we were just talking before, right now on the pad down in Cape Canaveral, you've got a Falcon Heavy launch vehicle, and inside it, the test payload is Elon Musk's car. It's his car that he's going to launch on the first launch of that vehicle, and he's going to put it in orbit around the sun, just for fun, I guess. So things are happening that we don't have policies in place that anticipated this. I would love to know what the FAA is doing on the launch license review, looking at the payload that's going into that. Were they prepared for this and certifying that this is okay to launch? So a lot of disruptive things going on. We also see commercial satellite companies getting into areas that used to be only the domain of governments and superpowers, really. Companies that are launching large fleets of Earth imaging satellites, companies that are launching radar satellites, companies that are launching what are effectively signals intelligence satellites that just pick up signals coming from Earth and geolocate them. All of this commercial. It's also a booming commercial space situational awareness market, looking up at space, tracking what objects are there, and selling that information to other companies who have a good economic incentive to want to know what is up there so they don't have a collision. So all this disruptive change going on in the commercial space market, and what we're seeing is that's making space more disordered because we don't have treaties, we don't have laws, we don't have policies, strategies in place to accommodate a lot of this. NOAA, for example, they have to license missions that are going up to do remote sensing of Earth. They've got a backlog, a huge backlog. So many more people are applying. They need relief. Congress has been looking at this. Several bills proposed to streamline the licensing process in Congress, but no progress yet. And the last point here, I want to talk a little more detail about this. Space is getting more dangerous. I said before that there are always counter space weapons from really the beginning of the space age. What's changed now is that from a military perspective, our military space systems are not predominantly used to support the nuclear mission. They still do support the nuclear mission, but we actually use our space systems across the full spectrum of conflict, from low-end counterterrorism, counterinsurgency operations, all the way to high-end combat with a near-peer competitor, even to nuclear conflict. Our space systems support our forces across that full spectrum, but we did not design our space systems to operate against the full spectrum of threats. And so what we're left with are some big juicy targets in space. And people know that U.S. military space systems give us an asymmetric advantage in conflict on the Earth, and so that naturally makes them want to go after our space systems. We're also seeing a proliferation of counter space capabilities. Now, if you turn to the next slide, normally when you think about counter space or ASAT systems, people immediately, their mind goes to kinetic, shooting a rocket up, blowing up something in space. That's certainly one form of attack. I think of those as kinetic physical attacks. You have direct ascent ASAT weapons that can do that. We've seen countries test those. Chinese tested one kinetically back in 2007. There's also co-orbital ASAT threats where you can launch something, it can stay in orbit, and then maneuver over to intersect you at some point. And of course, you can attack the ground station that's used to control and track satellites. Ground stations can be a weak point as well. There's a nuclear threat in space. A high altitude nuclear detonation, of course, would have widespread, indiscriminate effects in space. Then there's a whole host of non-kinetic forms of physical attack. So these are attacks that affect the physical operation of a satellite, but they don't involve touching it with anything physically. So, for example, a high-powered laser can be used to overheat components on a satellite. A lower-powered laser could be used to dazzle or blind the sensors on a satellite, which could effectively be a mission kill. You've got high-power microwave weapons that can upset the circuits on a satellite, cause computers to reboot or permanently damage them. And then, of course, there's electronic forms of attack. Jamming. You can jam the uplink of a signal. You can jam the downlink of a signal. You can spoof a signal. You can try to mimic a signal. We've seen folks demonstrate spoofing of GPS signals. Can fool your receiver into thinking that you're someplace that you're not. And then, of course, there's a wide range of cyber threats to our space systems, not to be underestimated. And, you know, across all of these systems, we've got a lot to worry about, a lot of different forms of attack. Now, I asked some senior military leaders a few weeks back, I said, given this wide range of threats to space systems, what are the types of threats that concern you the most? And I got a disappointing answer. They kind of shrugged and said, well, all of them. And, well, you know, not everything can be your top priority, right? So what is most concerning? So I thought, well, how would I answer that? And I'll tell you, it comes down to this. I am most worried about the threats that are most difficult to deter, because we don't want to have a conflict that extends into space. We certainly don't want a kinetic conflict in space, because this could end up ruining the environment for all of us. So I want to deter conflict in space. How do I deter it? What's required to deter it? And what are the things that are most difficult to deter? When I think through that, then I look at these threats in a different way. And I say, well, threats are difficult to deter if someone thinks they can get away with them, right? So if an adversary perceives that the cost is worth the benefit, then they may choose to do this, right? So I want to raise the cost to an adversary, and I want to reduce the benefits. So that's how we should think about protecting our space systems. I'm worried about things, though, where we can't do that very effectively. So, for example, some forms of attack can be difficult to attribute. If we don't know where the attack is coming from, it's hard to deter it. Someone may think they can get away with it. There are other forms of attack that are reversible. They're not permanent effects. Like a jammer, for example. You turn on a jammer, you deny us use of a space asset for a period of time, you can turn it off, things go back to normal. And so an adversary might think they can get away with that they can turn it on and turn it off, and we'll go back to the way things were. Now, we might not perceive it that way, but they may think we would. And so how do we deter them from doing this in the first place? So those are the threats that I am most concerned about, and that, you know, I want to see us working more on as a country. And it's not just our military space systems. We had a conference at CSIS, I guess it was last week. I lose track of time. And one of the speakers we had was the CIO from NOAA. And, you know, he made an excellent point that, first of all, a lot of our military space systems, they never need to interface with the public, right? Our nuclear command and control systems should not interface with the public ever, right? So you can keep these systems largely isolated, right? You can wall them off and build up big barriers. But our civil space systems and our commercial space systems, they have to interface with the public. NOAA's mission is to collect environmental information, analyze it, and distribute that. They have to disseminate it to the public. That is their mission. It's a safety of life mission. So they have to connect their space systems one way or the other to the internet to get the information out. And so they've got a bigger threat, bigger exposure because of that. And he raised the point that about 80% of the data that goes into NOAA's weather models, 80% of the data is collected from space systems. So it's a big vulnerability. And they did an experiment. They went back and you all remember Hurricane Sandy from a few years back. They took the weather models just before that storm hit land, and they ran the models again without any of the data that came from space. So they took that 80% of the data out and ran the models for Sandy. And you know what it showed? It showed that the storm was going to move harmlessly out to sea, go up to Greenland, and it would never affect the U.S. So it makes us appreciate that we need these space systems, right? Not just for national security, but for civil, for commercial purposes as well. They do have a lot of vulnerabilities, and we need to think about those more carefully and try to build systems and build strategies that deter and protect us against all these forms of threats that we see proliferating. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Todd. Thank you, Sean. You've both dealt with complex subjects, and you've done so in a way that is understandable to the layman. You've avoided acronyms and jargon, and so thank you for that. The attribution, if I can just start off, and then I'll go to the others out here with questions. The attribution issue, obviously, if people can get away with, countries can get away with attacks, they're more prone to do it. Sean, you said that in thinking ahead, one of the trends might be that states actually start to identify with the attacks. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that. Why would states do that? And would that make them more vulnerable, or is it a form of deterrence?
Yeah, first, one comment on attribution itself. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen attribution greatly improve in the cyber ecosystem. A lot of private companies doing much better at it, government entities doing much better at it. But high confidence attribution in real time still remains a challenge in many instances, specifically when the criminals or adversaries are intentionally trying to obfuscate their activity. So for me, it's a lot about the confidence level you would need to take a policy action in response to something and how quickly you can get that. My point I was making about willfully attributable cyber actions in the future, actually, Mark, is exactly that, to create a methodology of deterrence. We know in other military contexts, you would produce a new naval asset or Air Force asset, and you would publicize it as a deterrent effect. Or you had defense attaché exchanges looking at certain types of military capabilities, not giving all the ins and outs and the secrets, but at least making the other side aware of what you had to some degree of deterrence. And I think overt cyber actions in the future would actually contribute to stability in certain ways by making it known that certain capabilities could be brought to bear in a specific, focused, and controlled way if desired. I think what we have going on today is a lot of countries who are working on these capabilities, and it's expanding greatly, just like the space capabilities are, to a range of nations. But in many cases, knowing who has what capability and what degree of control they have over that capability remains uncertain. And when you talk about a military deterrent capability, it's not only about the ability to do something, but it's about the ability to do it at the time and place of your choosing in a controlled way. That's what coercive force is really about, and that's what's required for a deterrent strategy.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that. A lot of things, it's very similar in space, right? Where you need to attribute it quickly, because if you're talking about a military conflict and someone's doing something to interfere with your space system, you need that space system back online, right? You need it right now. You can't wait. And that's one of the challenges we have, is we may be able to figure out a month later that we were being jammed, and it wasn't accidental interference, and then maybe 6 months later we can figure out, we think it was coming from that general location. That doesn't cut it anymore. We need to know this in real time. Yes, this is jamming. This is intentional interference. Here's the location. Here's who's doing it. We've got to know that in real time if we're going to be able to act on it. The other thing, though, is picking up on what Sean said, is it's not enough to just be able to do it. People have to know that you can do it, right? So we need to build better attribution capabilities, and then we need to show it to people and let them know. They don't necessarily have to know how. They just need to know that we can do it. Because if you can't communicate you have a capability, that capability does not contribute to deterrence, because you can't be assured the other side knows about it.
Okay, thanks, Todd. So yes, I'm going to call on people. You'll wait till the microphone comes. I'll ask the woman in the fourth row here. State your name, affiliation, and pose a question. Remember, you're on the record.
Hi there, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. This has been a really interesting conversation, particularly the conversation about laws of armed conflict and cyber. That's something that space is having an issue figuring out as well. But specifically, Todd, I wanted to ask you about a trend that I didn't hear you mention, but I think it's going to be something we need to deal with, and that's the concept of overclassification for space. One of the things I found really fascinating with this whole concept with the Zuma satellite that was launched and either fell into the ocean or is hiding behind another satellite or never went up or is broadcasting secretly.
It's with the aliens.
Yes, they have it now.
I like that one.
One of the interesting follow-ups is that a private citizen decided he wanted to try and find it, and he found a NASA satellite that they thought they'd lost and is broadcasting, actually. And so it goes to my mind that shows nothing is really, I mean, you don't need to know what these objects are doing, but their presence in space cannot be classified any longer. But that's kind of goes against how I think military security space thinks about their assets, and that affects their ability to work with commercial, international. And I'd like to hear what you think about that.
No, that's a great question, Victoria. And that is one of the things that I think we've carried over with us from the first space age, because there used to be a time where we could just say, we launched a satellite, we'll put it in the catalog, but we're not going to give you the accurate orbital parameters. And no one else will be able to find it. And maybe the Soviets can find it at some point, but we're not going to make it easy for them. But no one else will be able to locate it. So we could keep a lot of things secret, or at least think we are keeping them secret. But today, things are getting more transparent. The Earth is getting more transparent. We saw with the leak of all the Fitbit data online, but it's also getting more transparent in space. And so we're not actually able to hide these things. So why do we continue this ruse that, there's nothing there? We just launched a classified satellite. We can't hide the fact that we launched, right? It's a big fiery cloud. But we try to pretend that we can hide, that an object just got put into orbit. We're not fooling anyone. So there is a tendency in the space community to just rampantly overclassify. It's just like a knee-jerk response. Like, well, we don't need to tell anyone this, so let's classify it. And that's one of the things I think that's got to change, especially if we're doing things in space that are intended to be a deterrent to bad actors, right? So a good example of unclassifying things, the Air Force a few years back, they declassified these satellites they call GSAP. And they are satellites that go around the geosynchronous belt in space, and they can inspect other satellites. I think that serves a good deterrent purpose, that adversaries can know, like, hey, if you're doing sneaky things up there, we can find out. We can come and get close to you and inspect your satellite, and we'll know what you're doing, right? So I think it has a positive, effect when we declassify things like that. I would take it a step further, and when we see someone doing something that's bad, let's release a picture. You can downgrade it, make it a little fuzzier than the actual resolution, but let's release a picture, name and shame. Let's show people what we can do, so that they'll be, maybe they'll think twice before they try to do something they shouldn't be doing in the future.
Good. I like this conversation about deterrence in good ways. Gentleman in the second row here. Again, the microphone's coming.
Hi, my name is Henk Sonius, Netherlands Embassy. I have a question for Sean. I saw you core themes, and I didn't see anything about AI, artificial intelligence, and the workforce, because one of the things you said, it's about people. So can you elaborate more on AI and the workforce?
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of other particular technologies or other important themes that may not have been captured on the slide, which is not meant to be completely comprehensive. But I think AI directly speaks to that relationship between people, processes, and technology. And when I look forward to the workforce of the future, I think you're going to have a lot of jobs, particularly in the lower skilled range and even in the entry levels of professional disciplines that are increasingly going to be taken by machine capabilities, I'm a lawyer by training, and we even see certain aspects of the legal profession being done now in an automated fashion. The same is going to be true with medical diagnoses in the medical profession and other areas. I think I recently saw a PricewaterhouseCoopers discussion, I think, said roughly 30% of jobs in the UK in the coming decade may be in competition with automated capabilities, replacing them. So I definitely think there will be a massive dislocation of individuals in the workplace caused by AI in the future. At the same time, I think there will be new applications and professions created for those individuals, whether it's managing the artificial intelligence operations, whether it's a new genre of activities that require human action. So I don't believe that everyone who's displaced by AI or robots in the future in the workforce will have nothing to do. I think there will be a greater degree of, call it unemployment for lack of a better word, than there is today as a result of that. But hopefully there will be some additional opportunities to partially offset that. And hopefully there'll be greater economic advantages at scale that will, solve the socioeconomic concerns associated with folks not active in the workplace. But I do definitely believe many jobs and many industries are going to increase in their automation, and that will have an impact on societies. Now, how those are dealt with will become more of a political, socioeconomic question, but I think the trend is inevitable. I don't know if that's fully answering your question or if you wanted to follow up, but that would be my general trend analysis.
I'd like to follow up on just hang up the microphone for me.
Just one follow-up on the workforce also, because it's difficult to grow the workforce in cyberspace especially. We don't have enough people. So you looked forward, very long on the line. You said like, hey, there's going to be, job change and everything. But right now, and it's expected for the next 5-10 years, we just can't get enough people to work in cyberspace and protect us.
Well, and that is absolutely true. I've seen a range of different numbers, but on the orders of hundreds of thousands of IT and IT security related positions that are available today, that there's not the competent applicants to fill those roles. So that is definitely a truism. I do believe to a certain degree, the marketplace of where the job opportunities are will lead young people and mid-career people as well to re-educate and retrain to meet some of those needs. It may not be a comfortable process for folks who have to switch their careers, but people adapt to where the jobs are, and I think that will happen. But in the long term, there is a dearth of personnel to do the jobs that we currently need in the IT and IT security space. For me, that's a matter of education and training, which remains a large obstacle both in the public and the private sector to create that. So I guess my answer is I'm going to agree with you and concur that how we build that workforce of tomorrow is something we need to be really focusing on today. Otherwise, we're training people for jobs that won't exist 10 years from now.
Thanks very much, Sean. Gentleman in the first row here.
My name is Paul Massaro. I'm a policy advisor at the U.S. Helsinki Commission on Capitol Hill. I cover international economic policy. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm specifically interested in this idea of cyber sanctions. We work a lot in sanctions policy. I work a lot in sanctions policy, specifically with regard to the Magnitsky Act and the Global Magnitsky Act, which, as you may know, are very specifically targeted at certain individuals for either gross human rights abuses or grand corruption. And when I think about cyber, I was just here puzzling that for the last, 20 minutes since you brought it up. Wouldn't that be just absolutely devastating to cut off someone's internet or something like that? I mean, it just seems almost inhumane. I'm not sure if you could do it in a way that would be targeted and meaningful and bring about the sort of foreign policy consequences that we'd like to see. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that, how you imagine that shaping up and that sort of foreign policy tool.
So I had it in the column of 2020 and beyond because I think it's a fascinating challenge, and how it would play out would have both a technical and a policy component. Technically speaking, you could feasibly do it within a jurisdiction. Your smartphone has an IMSI and an IMEI number associated with it. If someone controlled the infrastructure, that could be a private entity whose network you used, or it could be a public law enforcement capacity who had access to controlling those networks, could prevent your phone from making calls, could prevent your phone from receiving data. So technologically speaking, I do believe it is possible within particular jurisdictions or within particular networks. Now, getting a global ban or sanction on someone would probably be as difficult as getting a global financial ban, where different countries may agree or disagree with whether this person was an outlaw, a dissident, who should be subject to such matters. So, for example, in the United States, when we do financial sanctions, it involves dollar-denominated transactions and interfacing with U.S. financial institutions. Whether the EU or China or other entities impose similar sanctions in their currency spaces or in their banking systems remains up to those other sovereigns. So at a technical level, I think it's theoretically feasible. At a policy level, I think there would be jurisdictional questions among multiple jurisdictions. And then the question becomes policy. And you mentioned, what about the human right or the issue? There definitely is discussion of are certain digital rights and access to the internet and information a human right. We see the World Summit on Information Society and other entities discussing those issues. I'm not going to pretend to sit here and have the definitive answer on that, but I think it's a worthwhile question that would need to be asked, and to determine what the permissible coercive pressure to be put on someone is versus what the unacceptable level is. So I can imagine freezing your bank account but not making you starve to death. So should you be allowed to receive a phone call from your child? Possibly. Should you be prevented from interfacing with the other members of your criminal syndicate? Perhaps. So I think there's a lot of details that would need to be worked out. But given how central these technologies and capabilities are to doing anything that you want to do in today's world, it's every bit as important as money's been for the last couple millennia. I can't imagine that governments won't start thinking of leveraging that pressure point the way they've leveraged currencies as a pressure point.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, Mike, in the third row here.
Mike Massaro, PBS Online NewsHour. A follow-up sort of to the previous question. After the Sputnik, and maybe I'm the only one around who remembers that, there was an entire national effort in the United States to build up science, education, the National Defense Education Act. I get the impression, and I hope I'm wrong, that with the exception of the defense and military establishment, there's very much an anti-science mood in the top of our government and in Washington. And do you see that trickling down and having an effect on producing the kind of people we need to deal with the issues you're talking about?
I'm going to presume that's to both of us, and if Todd has a thought, I'll let him start, and I'll join.
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't want to presume that there's a certain sentiment within the top levels of the government. Certainly not within all members of the administration. But what we know what we're not seeing. We're not seeing the investments in education that you would expect if we were taking these types of issues really seriously. That in part because a lot of the innovation, a lot of the new research and development is not happening through government funding anymore. It's happening through private sector funding. And so they've got to make a business case. It used to be that one of the predominant investors in research and development in the U.S. economy was the U.S. government. And so they did that through things like grants to universities and major programs that would hire tons of engineers and scientists to do work. And then there were all these economic multiplier effects that came after that when these folks went out and worked in other industries. We're not seeing that today. And so, it's similar, I think, to the lack of infrastructure investment that we see in the country. There's a lack of investment in education and R&D and STEM. And, what do you do to change that? Well, we're talking about big government spending, big government programs. And right now, the budget environment doesn't seem conducive to taking on a big challenge like that again. But if we're going to take a lot of these challenges seriously, cybersecurity, what's going on in space, what's going on in many other domains, and make sure that the United States is at the vanguard, that we're leading these efforts, that we're out there in the front so that we can write the rules, we can be part of establishing the way this will work in the world, the rules of the road. Then we've got to make those investments, but politically we seem hamstrung when it comes to that.
And I'm not going to pretend to be able to speak on behalf of the higher levels of the administration either. I'll just offer a couple observations. In the cyber or computer world, one clear observation is we have a huge draw for youth to be creating things at the application and the entrepreneurial business level. But in many cases, those individuals who are coding apps and creating companies are not well versed in understanding the technologies that underlie the critical infrastructures. It's the equivalent of understanding how your sink works, but not understanding how the public sewage system works and water sanitation system. Understanding what's under the hood is critical to national security and public safety going forward. Yet that is not what is the draw. The draw is to create an app, market it, and sell your company off. So that's one disconnect. And then I think at a societal level, whether it's the U.S. or other countries, I think China is doing a lot of investment in research. But when I look at the United States, I ask, what's the equivalent of today's Apollo program, Manhattan Project, or Human Genome Project? And I'm looking for that national leadership and impetus to not only create game-changing technologies, but also to inspire the next generation to want to be in those hard sciences and engineering. And quite frankly, I don't know what program I would point to today towards that end.
Thanks very much, Sean and Todd. I had lots of questions myself. I promised that we would end at 3 o'clock. So I have all these North Korea and Iran related questions I'm going to talk to you about afterwards. And with that, please join me in thanking Sean and Todd for an interesting discussion.